Have you noticed something interesting about the youngest adults in the room? They're the ones actually saying the quiet part out loud. I'm having a panic attack. My therapist says I need a mental health day. And if you're over 30, you might remember a time when saying any of that would have gotten you some very uncomfortable looks. But Gen Z, they talk about therapy the way previous generations talked about the weather. So what happened? What makes this generation so dramatically different when it comes to mental health? And what does psychology tell us about whether this openness is helping or creating new problems we haven't seen before? Let's rewind for a second. If you grew up in the 80s or 90s, mental health was this shadowy thing people whispered about. Depression was just being sad. Anxiety was worrying too much. And therapy? That was for people who were really struggling, which was code for we don't talk about that. The cultural script was basically handle it privately, don't burden others, and definitely don't make it your personality. Fast forward to today, and Gen Z has completely rewritten that script. They've taken mental health out of the shadows and put it center stage, hashtagged it, made it part of their digital identity, and turned vulnerability into a kind of social currency. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions about whether this is good or bad, let's look at what's actually happening in their brains and their world. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up entirely in the digital age. They've never known a world without social media, without constant connectivity, without the pressure of curating a life online while living one offline. Research from the American Psychological Association shows that Gen Z reports higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression than any previous generation at the same age. But here's the fascinating part. They're also more likely to seek help, to name what they're feeling, and to treat mental health as a legitimate priority rather than a personal failing. There's this concept in psychology called psychological literacy, which is basically your ability to understand and articulate your own mental states, and Gen Z has it in abundance. They know the difference between anxiety and an anxiety disorder. They understand what triggers are. They can tell you about their attachment style before dessert arrives. This isn't just vocabulary, it's a fundamental shift in how they relate to their inner worlds. Where previous generations might have powered through or self-medicated or just suffered in silence, Gen Z is more likely to say, wait, this doesn't feel right, and I deserve to feel better. But let's talk about the flip side, because psychology is rarely simple. There's emerging research suggesting that while awareness is powerful, there's also something called prevalence inflation. It's this phenomenon where increased awareness of mental health conditions can sometimes lead people to over-identify with symptoms or label normal stress responses as clinical disorders. When everyone's talking about their mental health all the time, when every difficult emotion gets pathologized, it can actually make it harder to distinguish between ordinary human struggle and something that genuinely needs professional intervention. It's like if you learned about headaches and suddenly every tiny twinge became a potential brain tumor in your mind. And here's where it gets really interesting from a neurological standpoint. Gen Z's brains literally developed differently than their parents' brains. The constant stimulation, the dopamine hits from notifications, the way they process information in rapid bursts rather than sustained focus, all of this has shaped their neural pathways. Studies using fMRI scans show that digital natives process information differently, with more activity in areas associated with visual processing and attention switching, but potentially less development in areas linked to deep focus and emotional regulation. So when a Gen Z person says they're struggling with anxiety or executive function, they're not making it up or being dramatic. Their brains are genuinely wired for a world that demands constant multitasking and immediate response, which is exhausting in ways previous generations didn't experience. But here's what I find most hopeful about this whole shift. Gen Z isn't just talking about mental health for attention or to seem interesting. They're doing it because they watched millennials burn out in silence, they saw their Gen X parents become cynical and disconnected, and they decided there had to be a better way. They're saying, what if we just named the thing? What if we stopped pretending we're fine when we're not? And that takes enormous courage, especially in a world that still, despite all this progress, has plenty of people ready to call them weak or oversensitive. There's this beautiful paradox at the heart of Gen Z's relationship with mental health. They're simultaneously the most anxious generation and the most willing to do something about it. They're the most connected and the most lonely. They're the most aware of their struggles and the most determined to rewrite the narrative around those struggles. And maybe that's exactly what healing looks like on a generational scale. not the absence of problems, but the willingness to face them head on, to seek support, to treat mental health with the same seriousness as physical health. So if you're Gen Z and you've ever felt like maybe you're too open about your therapy appointments or too willing to name your struggles, consider this. You're not oversharing. You're participating in one of the most significant cultural shifts around mental health in modern history. You're teaching older generations that vulnerability isn't weakness, that asking for help is strength, that your mental health matters just as much as your productivity or your achievements. And if you're from an older generation watching this unfold, maybe the lesson here isn't that Gen Z is too sensitive. Maybe it's that they're finally sensitive enough. The conversation about mental health isn't going back into the shadows. Gen Z made sure of that, and honestly, that might be one of their greatest contributions to the world. So tell me, whether you're Gen Z or not, how has your relationship with mental health awareness changed over time? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next one, and remember, talking about your mental health isn't a trend. It's just being human, finally out loud.